There is a specific kind of silence that follows a truly devastating revelation. It isn't just the absence of noise. It's a physical weight, a vacuum that sucks the air out of the room and leaves everyone gasping. On British Airways Flight 114 from New York to London, that silence fell over the first-class cabin like a guillotine. We have all witnessed entitlement. We have all seen arrogance masked as superiority. But what happened at 35,000 feet between a supposedly important billionaire and an exhausted black woman in a faded grey hoodie wasn't just a clash of egos. It was a masterclass in cosmic retribution, an execution delivered with such quiet, lethal precision that the passengers who witnessed it still talk about it to this day. The terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, frantic announcements, and the low collective murmur of thousands of travelers desperate to be somewhere else. But for Dr. Josephine Carter, the noise was nothing more than a dull static behind the overwhelming roar of her own exhaustion. Josephine, Josie to her friends, Dr. Carter to the medical boards that frequently marveled at her surgical innovations, felt like she was moving underwater. She was 36 years old, one of the youngest and most sought-after pediatric neurosurgeons on the East Coast, and she had not slept in 42 hours. The past 2 days had been a blur of sterile lights, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and a marathon surgery on a 7-year-old boy that had tested the absolute limits of her physical and mental endurance. She had saved him. That was the only thought keeping her upright as she bypassed the crowded coffee kiosks and headed toward Gate 45. Because of the sudden emergency nature of her trip to London, Josie had no time to pack properly or change into the tailored, professional attire she usually wore when traveling for conferences. Instead, she was dressed for survival. A pair of worn-in black sweatpants, a faded Yale University hoodie that had belonged to a late father, and a pair of beat-up running shoes. Her thick, natural hair was pulled up into a messy, utilitarian bun, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. She looked exactly like someone who had just crawled out of a war zone, which, in the realm of pediatric neurology, she practically had. Boarding for the first-class cabin of Flight 114 was called, and Josie practically dragged her feet towards the jet bridge. Her ticket, an exorbitant last-minute purchase made by the hospital in London that was desperately awaiting her arrival, guaranteed her seat 2A. All she wanted was to recline the pod into a flatbed, pull the heavy blanket over her head, and sleep until the wheels hit the tarmac at Heathrow. She boarded the Boeing 777, nodding a tired greeting to the lead flight attendant, a sharp-eyed woman named Benjamin, whose name tag gleamed under the cabin lights. Josie found her pod, dropped her small duffel bag into the overhead bin with a heavy sigh, and collapsed into the plush leather of 2A. She didn't bother looking around. She simply closed her eyes and let the residual adrenaline of the past 48 hours begin to drain from her system. 10 minutes later, Richard Pendleton boarded the aircraft. Richard was a man who moved through the world with the absolute certainty that it had been built specifically for him. At 58, he was the chief executive officer of Pendleton Global Logistics, a massive shipping conglomerate, and a man whose net worth was casually estimated in the high 9 figures. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most cars, a platinum Patek Philippe watch that caught the cabin lighting, and an expression of permanent, low-level irritation. Richard was not having a good week. His company was facing a potential union strike. His investments had taken a slight dip, and, most pressingly, he was being forced to fly to London on a Sunday evening to deal with a sudden, catastrophic family emergency. His irritation was palpable as he marched down the aisle of the first-class cabin, trailing a terrified-looking personal assistant who was carrying his leather briefcase. Richard stopped at row 2. His ticket was for seat 2B. He looked down at his pod, and then his eyes drifted over to the left, landing on seat 2A. The sight of Josephine Carter, slumped in her seat, wearing a faded hoodie, Her exhausted face, completely devoid of makeup, acted like a spark to the powder keg of his already volatile mood. In Richard's rigidly categorized worldview, first class was a sanctuary. It was a velvet-roped fortress meant to separate people of consequence from the unwashed masses. It was an environment of tailored suits, designer luggage, and quiet, respectful deference. The presence of a black woman in sweatpants and a messy bun shattered the illusion of his exclusive enclave. It simply did not compute. He didn't see a human being in need of rest. He saw an intrusion, an error. "Excuse me," Richard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed that specific, cutting frequency of a man used to giving orders. Josie, hovering on the very edge of sleep, didn't hear him. Richard's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, leaning over the console that separated their pods. I said, "Excuse me." Josie blinked, dragging her heavy eyelids open. She looked up at the older man looming over her, trying to focus her blurry vision. "Sorry," she mumbled, her voice raspy from disuse. "Do you need to get by?" "No, I do not need to get by," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured towards the back of the plane. "I believe you are in the wrong cabin." Josie frowned, her tired brain taking a moment to process the words. "No, I'm in 2A. This is my seat." Richard let out a sharp, incredulous breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Listen to me, young lady. I don't know if there was a mix-up at the gate, or if you simply saw an empty pod and thought you could sneak in here for a joyride before the flight attendants noticed. But this is the first-class cabin. Economy is back there, through the curtain." The casual arrogance of the assumption hit Josie like a splash of cold water. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it forced her awake. She sat up slightly, rubbing her temples. She didn't have the energy for this. Not today. Not after holding a child's brain in her hands for 14 hours. "My ticket says 2A, Josie said calmly, refusing to match his aggressive energy. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm trying to sleep." She reached for her noise-cancelling headphones, a clear, universal signal that the conversation was over. But Richard Pendleton was not a man who was used to being dismissed, least of all by someone he deemed beneath him. He turned toward the aisle and snapped his fingers loudly. "Miss, flight attendant, we have a situation here." Benjamin, the lead flight attendant, hurried over, her professional smile firmly in place despite the obvious tension. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "There has been a mistake," Richard declared loudly, ensuring that the other passengers in the cabin, a smattering of executives and wealthy travelers, could hear him. "This woman is in my row. She clearly belongs in the economy cabin. I need you to check her boarding pass and escort her back to her proper seat before we take off." Benjamin looked at Josie, then back at Richard. "Sir, I scanned everyone's boarding pass at the door. I can assure you that every passenger in this cabin is ticketed for these seats." Richard's face flushed a mottled red. "Are you seriously telling me she paid for a first-class ticket? Look at her. She looks like a vagrant. This is unacceptable. I pay a premium for the service, for a certain standard of environment, not to sit next to someone who looks like she just wandered in off the street." Josie stopped, the headphones halfway to her ears. The blatant racism and classism weren't disguised. They were worn proudly on Richard's sleeve. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She noted the pulsing vein in his forehead, the rigid set of his shoulders, the furious entitlement burning in his eyes. "I don't need to explain my wardrobe or my finances to you," Josie said, her voice dropping into a register of icy authority that usually commanded immediate silence in an operating room. "My seat is 2A. If you have a problem with sitting next to me, I suggest you take it up with the airline and rebook your flight. Otherwise, sit down and be quiet." A soft gasp echoed from across the aisle. A young tech entrepreneur in seat 3C had stopped pretending to read his tablet and was openly staring. Richard looked as though he had been physically struck. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he hissed, leaning in closer, his voice vibrating with rage. "I don't," Josie replied smoothly, slipping her headphones over her ears. "And I don't care." The heavy Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate, the massive engines roaring to life. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Richard Pendleton had spent the entire taxiing process furiously typing on his phone, occasionally shooting venomous glares at the woman in seat 2A. Josie had closed her eyes, letting the classical music in her headphones wash over her, but sleep stubbornly refused to return. The adrenaline from the confrontation had spiked her cortisol levels. She mentally cycled through breathing exercises, trying to lower her heart rate, reminding herself of the critical work awaiting her in London. She needed her hands steady. She needed her mind sharp. She couldn't afford to let a miserable, prejudiced old man steal her focus. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the flight attendants began their service. Benjamin approached row 2 with a cart of warm towels and premium beverages. "Would you care for a drink, Mr. Pendleton?" Benjamin asked, attempting to maintain a cheerful demeanor. "A double scotch." "Neat. Macallan 18, if you actually have it," Richard snapped, not looking up from his tablet. He waited until Benjamin poured the amber liquid into a crystal glass and set it on his console. Then he raised his voice just enough to ensure it carried over the ambient hum of the aircraft. "It's a shame what's happened to commercial aviation," Richard said aloud, seemingly to the cabin at large, but his eyes were fixed on Josie's profile. "They hand out upgrades like candy these days. Pity points, diversity quotas. It used to be that you had to actually earn your way into this cabin. Now, any low-level DEI hire with enough frequent flyer miles can drag the entire standard down." Josie's eyes snapped open. The music in her headphones suddenly felt entirely inadequate. She paused the symphony and slowly turned her head. Richard caught her movement and smirked, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch. He was baiting her. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to get loud, to get angry, to fulfill whatever ugly, stereotypical narrative he had already written for her in his mind, so he could have her restrained or arrested upon landing. Josie knew the game. She had played it 1,000 times before. In medical school, during her residency, in boardrooms full of older white men who assumed she was the nurse, the secretary, or the diversity hire. She knew that her anger, no matter how justified, would be weaponized against her. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly, Mr. Pendleton?" Josie asked, her voice dangerously calm, the volume perfectly controlled. Richard feigned surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I offend you? I was simply making an observation about the decline of corporate standards. It's nothing personal. It's just economics. Some people build empires, and some people just take up space." "Sir," Benjamin interjected, stepping forward with a look of genuine alarm, "I must ask you to keep your voice down and refrain from disturbing the other passengers." "I am not disturbing anyone," Richard shot back, pointing a manicured finger at Benjamin. "She is the disturbance. I am a Diamond Medallion member. I fly 300,000 miles a year with this airline. I expect a certain level of decorum, and I certainly don't expect to be seated next to someone who looks and acts like she belongs in a bus terminal." He turned back to Josie, emboldened by the alcohol and his own perceived invincibility. "I don't know who bought your ticket. Maybe a rich boyfriend, maybe some affirmative action corporate retreat. But let's not pretend we are equals. We are not the same." Josie slowly reached up and pulled her headphones down, resting them around her neck. She unbuckled her seatbelt and shifted her body so she was fully facing him. The young tech entrepreneur across the aisle, a guy named Marcus. Wait, the prompt said, no Marcus. Let's name him Julian. Wait, no Julian either. Let's name him Arthur. Pulled his phone out, discreetly resting it against his knee, the camera lens peeking out. "You're right," Josie said softly, her voice carrying a chilling gravity. We are absolutely not the same." Richard leaned forward, sensing victory, assuming she was backing down. "Glad you finally understand that. So why don't you do us all a favor? Pull your hood up and pretend you aren't here for the next 6 hours." "We are not the same," Josie continued, as if he hadn't spoken, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a laser beam. "Because when I look at people, I see lives. I see nervous systems. I see beating hearts. I see humanity. When you look at people, you only see reflections of your own bloated ego. You see price tags. You see hierarchies that you desperately need to believe in to justify your own existence." Richard's smirk vanished. The scotch sloshed precariously in his glass. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Josie challenged, not moving an inch. "You're going to complain to the manager of the airplane? You've made a lot of assumptions about me since I sat down. You've assumed my financial status, my profession, and my right to exist in your general vicinity. You want to know how I got this ticket?" "I couldn't care less," Richard spat, though his eyes betrayed his rising unease. "Oh, I think you do," Josie said. "I think it's eating you alive, because you can't fathom a world where someone who looks like me doesn't have to serve you, defer to you, or beg for your permission to breathe your air." The cabin had gone completely silent. The clinking of silverware from the galley had stopped. Even the flight attendants were frozen in place, watching the confrontation unfold. Richard slammed his glass down on the console. "Listen here, you arrogant little—" "No, you listen," Josie interrupted, her voice finally raising a fraction, cutting through his bluster like a scalpel through tissue. "You have spent the last hour trying to make me feel small. But your insults don't work on me, Mr. Pendleton, because I know exactly who I am. The question is, do you know what kind of fragile, insecure man you have to be to pick a fight with a stranger on an airplane just to feel powerful?" Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. He loomed over the console, pointing his finger directly in Josie's face. "I am the CEO of Pendleton Global," he bellowed, losing whatever shred of composure he had left. "I manage thousands of employees. I am flying to London because my family is facing a crisis that you couldn't possibly comprehend, and I demand absolute silence. I will have you met by security at Heathrow. I will make sure you never fly this airline again. I will ruin whatever pathetic little career you have." The threat hung in the pressurized air of the cabin. A few rows back, a woman gasped. Benjamin, the flight attendant, reached for the intercom phone to call the captain, her hands shaking slightly. Josie did not flinch. She did not shrink back from the finger pointing inches from her nose. Instead, a strange, profound calm washed over her. The exhaustion that had been dragging her down suddenly evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She looked at Richard Pendleton, a man unraveling at the seams, a man who had proudly declared his identity as if it were a weapon to strike her down. Pendleton. The name had registered vaguely when Benjamin had addressed him earlier, but it had been buried under her fatigue. Now, looking at the furious man towering over her, his words echoed in her mind. "I am flying to London because my family is facing a crisis that you couldn't possibly comprehend." Josie's mind, trained to recall thousands of pages of medical charts, anatomical maps, and patient histories, clicked the pieces together with terrifying speed. Before she left Johns Hopkins, the chief of surgery had briefed her on the VIP status of her emergency patient, a catastrophic horseback riding accident in the English countryside, a severe traumatic brain injury, a subdural hematoma complicated by a rare vascular anomaly that British surgeons were hesitant to operate on. They needed the best pediatric neurovascular specialist in the world. They needed Dr. Josephine Carter. The patient was an 8-year-old girl named Lily Pendleton. Josie looked at the man's bespoke suit, the expensive watch, the veins throbbing in his neck. He wasn't just a racist, entitled CEO. He was a terrified grandfather lashing out at the world because he was entirely powerless to save the person he loved. It didn't excuse his abhorrent behavior. Nothing could. But it provided the context, and it provided Josie with the ultimate, devastating hand to play. Josie slowly pushed herself up from her seat until she was standing eye to eye with him. Despite her sweatpants and messy bun, she suddenly seemed to fill the entire cabin, radiating an authority that made Richard unconsciously take a half step back. "You're going to ruin my career?" Josie asked. Her voice was no longer a defensive shield. It was a quiet, inevitable force of nature. "With one phone call," Richard sneered, trying to maintain his bravado, but a flicker of doubt had entered his eyes. "Make it," Josie said softly. Richard blinked. "What?" "Make the call," Josie repeated, holding her hand out toward him. "Call your board of directors. Call the airline. Call the Queen of England for all I care. But before you do, let me tell you exactly who you are threatening to ruin." Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. "Let me guess. You're a social media influencer. A blogger." "My name," Josie said, enunciating every syllable with crystal precision, "is Dr. Josephine Carter." Richard stared at her. The name meant nothing to him in that context. He just looked impatient. "Am I supposed to be impressed? Are you a dentist? A chiropractor?" "I am the chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital," Josie continued, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the cabin. "I hold 3 patents in neurovascular surgical techniques, and I have spent the last 42 hours awake performing back-to-back craniotomies, which is why I am currently standing in front of you in sweatpants instead of a designer suit." A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. Arthur, the young tech entrepreneur, let out a low whistle. Richard's arrogant posture faltered slightly, but his pride refused to let him back down completely. "Good for you. It doesn't give you the right to—" "I am not finished," Josie snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Richard snapped his mouth shut. "I am on this flight," Josie said, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him, "because 3 hours ago I received a frantic call from the chief of medicine at Wellington Hospital in London. They have a patient, an 8-year-old girl who suffered a severe traumatic brain injury from a fall. She has a complex vascular anomaly that is actively bleeding into her brain." All the color drained from Richard Pendleton's face. It happened so fast it was almost comical, like a bucket of white paint had been thrown over his flushed skin. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. His arms, previously crossed in defiance, dropped limply to his sides. "The surgical team in London," Josie continued, her voice devoid of any mercy or pity, "refuse to operate because the risk of a catastrophic hemorrhage is too high. They told the family there was only one surgeon in the world who had successfully performed the procedure required to save this little girl's life. So the family's trust chartered a private jet, which broke down on the tarmac. As a last resort, they bought the single remaining first-class ticket on a commercial airliner to fly me across the Atlantic." Richard's hands began to shake. The crystal glass of scotch on the console beside him vibrated as he bumped against it. "Her name," Josie said, delivering the final, crushing blow, "is Lily Pendleton, and unless I am very much mistaken, Mr. Pendleton, you are her grandfather." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a man realizing he had just stepped on a landmine of his own making, and the trigger was already clicking. Richard staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his seat. He fell into the pod, staring up at Josie with eyes wide, with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, undeniable shame. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words, but his throat was sealed shut. Every passenger in the cabin was staring at him. Benjamin, the flight attendant, had covered her mouth with both hands. Arthur, the guy filming, lowered his phone, realizing that what he was witnessing had transcended viral internet drama and become something deeply, painfully human. Josie stood over him. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just looked at him with the cold, professional detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. "You asked me how I got this ticket," Josie said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only he could hear. Your family paid $20,000 for me to sit in this seat, Mr. Pendleton. They paid it because my hands are the only thing standing between your granddaughter and the grave. You spent the last hour treating me like dirt on your shoe because of how I look. You threatened to have me arrested. You threatened to ruin my career." She leaned in, her face inches from his. "So," Josie whispered, "do you still want to have me removed from the plane?" If a man's pride had a physical sound when it broke, the first-class cabin of Flight 114 would have been deafened by the crack. Richard Pendleton sank into the luxurious leather of Seat 2B as if all the bones in his body had suddenly turned to ash. The ruddy, furious color that had painted his face only moments ago was replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, searching for words that simply did not exist. The billionaire CEO, the man who moved global markets with a single phone call, was entirely, profoundly paralyzed. My Lily," he finally choked out, the syllables scraping against his vocal cords. His eyes darted to Josie's face, searching for a punchline, a lie, anything to indicate that this was a cruel trick. But he found only the steady, unyielding gaze of a woman who held his granddaughter's life in her hands. "Yes," Josie replied, her voice dropping the aggressive edge but retaining its absolute authority. "Lily. She has a traumatic subarachnoid hemorrhage and a ruptured arteriovenous malformation. Her intracranial pressure is rising by the hour. Do you understand what that means, Mr. Pendleton?" Richard shook his head slowly, a single tremor racking his shoulders. He looked small. Suddenly, he looked like a very old, very frightened man. "It means," Josie said, leaning in just enough to ensure only he could hear the clinical reality, "that her brain is drowning in its own blood. The surgical window to relieve that pressure and clip the anomaly without causing permanent catastrophic brain damage is closing rapidly. Every minute counts. Every ounce of my focus counts." Richard let out a broken, pathetic sound, a sob quickly swallowed by terror. His hands, previously balling into fists to intimidate her, now reached out, trembling, as if he wanted to grab her sleeve and beg for mercy. Josie took a deliberate step back, out of his reach. She did not want his apologies. She did not want his tears. Karma had delivered its verdict with brutal efficiency. But Josie was a physician first. Her priority was the patient waiting across the ocean, not the broken man weeping in Seat 2B. "Dr. Carter, Richard stammered, tears welling in the corners of his eyes, his voice cracking. "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know who you were. Please, you have to save her. I'll pay you anything. I'll double whatever the hospital is paying you. I'll give you $1 million right now. Just please." Josie's expression hardened. Even now, in the absolute depths of his despair, his instinct was to buy his way out of his sins. He still thought money was the great equalizer. "You don't have enough money to buy your way out of the disrespect you showed me today," Josie said, her voice a cold whisper. "And you certainly don't need to bribe me to do my job. I am not going to save your granddaughter because you're rich, or because you're sorry, or because you are begging me. I am going to save her because she is an 8-year-old child who deserves to live." Richard flinched as if he had been struck. He squeezed his eyes shut, the first tear spilling over and cutting a jagged path down his cheek. "Now," Josie said, turning her back to him and grabbing her heavy blanket from her seat. "I have not slept in almost 2 days. When this plane lands, I have to walk directly into an operating theater and perform a 12-hour craniotomy on a child. If my hands shake because I am exhausted, she dies. Do you understand me?" Richard nodded frantically, his eyes wide and terrified. "Good," Josie said. She settled back into her pod in Seat 2A, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Then do not speak another word to me for the rest of this flight. Do not look at me. Do not clear your throat in my direction. Let me sleep." She reached up and pulled her noise-cancelling headphones over her ears. As she did, she caught the eye of Benjamin, the lead flight attendant, who was standing a few feet away, her posture rigid with awe. Benjamin gave Josie a slow, definitive nod of absolute respect, then immediately marched over to Richard's console and silently, swiftly confiscated his glass of Macallan 18. Richard didn't even try to stop her. For the next 6 hours, as the Boeing 777 hurtled through the night sky over the Atlantic Ocean, the dynamic in the first-class cabin shifted into something entirely surreal. Arthur, the tech entrepreneur, had quietly put his phone away, recognizing that the situation was too grave for internet spectacle. The other passengers spoke in hushed whispers, casting sideways glances at the broken billionaire in 2B. Richard Pendleton sat in the exact same position for the entire flight. He did not recline his seat. He did not ask for a blanket. He did not eat. He just stared blankly at the back of the seat in front of him, vibrating with a toxic cocktail of anxiety, guilt, and the agonizing realization that his arrogance could have doomed the only person in the world he truly loved. Every time the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, he jolted, his terrified eyes darting towards the sleeping woman in 2A, silently praying she wouldn't wake up angry. Josie, despite the adrenaline of the confrontation, finally succumbed to her absolute exhaustion. She slept deeply, her body taking over and forcing the rest she so desperately needed to face the monumental task waiting for her in London. Dr. Carter, a gentle hand on her shoulder, pulled Josie from the heavy depths of sleep. She blinked, the bright cabin lights stinging her eyes. Benjamin was leaning over her, an apologetic but urgent smile on her face. "We are on final approach to London Heathrow, Doctor," Benjamin said softly. The captain received a message from air traffic control. "There is a metropolitan police escort and an emergency medical transport waiting for you on the tarmac." Josie sat up, rubbing her face, instantly shifting gears from passenger to surgeon. The fog of sleep vanished, replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. "Thank you, Benjamin. How long until touchdown?" 10 minutes. We've been given priority clearance to land." Josie nodded, securing her tray table and tightening her seatbelt. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Richard. He looked catastrophic. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his face was drawn and pale. He was staring at her with an expression of desperate, silent pleading, but honoring her command, he kept his mouth firmly shut. The heavy aircraft hit the runway with a jolt, the engines roaring in reverse thrust. Even before the plane had fully slowed to a taxi, Josie could see the flashing blue lights through her window. A convoy of police vehicles and a sleek, high-speed medical transport van were idling near a private section of the tarmac. The moment the seatbelt sign chimed off, Benjamin positioned herself in the aisle, physically blocking anyone else from moving. "Ladies and gentlemen," Benjamin announced over the intercom, her voice authoritative, "please remain seated. We have a medical emergency priority disembarkation." Benjamin turned to Josie and gestured towards the door. "Dr. Carter, please." Josie grabbed her duffel bag. She didn't bother looking back at Richard as she walked past him. She strode out of the aircraft door and into the damp, chilling London morning air. At the bottom of the stairs, a tall, frantic-looking man in a rumpled trench coat was waiting alongside 2 armed police officers. He had the same jawline as Richard, but his eyes were entirely different. They were kind, exhausted, and currently brimming with sheer panic. "Dr. Carter," the man asked, practically lunging forward to take her bag, "I'm William Pendleton, Lily's father." Josie offered a brief, empathetic nod. "Mr. Pendleton, how is she?" "She's stable, but her intracranial pressure spiked again an hour ago," William said, his voice trembling as he led her towards the waiting transport van. "Dr. Hayes at Wellington Hospital said they are out of time. They have her prepped in Theatre 4. They're just waiting for you." "Then let's go," Josie said, climbing into the back of the van. As the doors slammed shut, Josie glanced out the tinted window. Richard Pendleton had just emerged from the aircraft, staggering down the stairs. The police officers at the bottom held up their hands, stopping him from following his son into the transport. He was not the priority. He was just a civilian now. He stood on the damp tarmac, watching the van carrying his son and the surgeon he had humiliated speed away, sirens blaring, leaving him behind in the exhaust fumes. The ride through London was a blur of flashing lights and screeching tires. The police escort cleared the morning traffic with brutal efficiency, parting the sea of cars like Moses at the Red Sea. In the back of the van, Josie opened her tablet, reviewing the latest CT scans William had provided. "The hemorrhage has expanded," Josie muttered, tracing the white blooming mass on the black and white scan. "The AVM is deep. Parietal lobe. We're going to have to approach it microscopically. Has Dr. Hayes prepared the stealth navigation system?" Yes. Whatever you asked for, they have it," William said, staring at her as if she were an angel sent from the heavens. "Dr. Carter, I don't know how to thank you. My father said he spoke to you on the plane. He texted me from the air, said there was a terrible misunderstanding." Josie paused, her eyes flickering up from the screen to look at William. The son was clearly nothing like the father. He was terrified, humble, and completely oblivious to the extent of Richard's abhorrent behavior. "Your father and I had a brief conversation," Josie said diplomatically, returning her eyes to the scans. "But none of that matters right now. My only concern is Lily." 10 minutes later, the van screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance of Wellington Hospital, one of the most prestigious private medical facilities in Europe. A team of scrub-clad nurses and a frantic-looking British surgeon, Dr. Harrison Hayes, were waiting at the double doors. The moment Josie stepped out of the van, still wearing her faded Yale hoodie and beat-up running shoes, the atmosphere shifted. There were no judgments about her appearance here. Here, she was a god. "Dr. Carter, thank Christ you're here," Dr. Hayes said, rushing forward to shake her hand. "I've reviewed the latest angios. It's a nightmare in there. If we don't decompress within the hour, she's going to herniate." "Show me the scans on the high-res monitors," Josie ordered, her stride long and purposeful as they hurried through the sterile corridors. "I need 30 minutes to scrub in and review the 3D mapping. Have anesthesia lower her body temperature by another degree to protect the brain tissue. We are going to need every second of metabolic advantage we can get." "Right away, Doctor," Hayes said, deferring to her instantly. As they approached the surgical wing, the double doors swung open, and a breathless, red-faced Richard Pendleton came bursting through the waiting room. He had clearly hired a private car to race from Heathrow, desperate to catch up. "William!" Richard yelled, rushing toward his son. "William, how is she?" William grabbed his father's shoulders. "Oh, she's critical, Dad. But Dr. Carter is here. She's taking over." Richard looked past his son and locked eyes with Josie, who was standing at the threshold of the sterile surgical corridor. The billionaire looked stripped of all his armor. He was just a grandfather now, facing the most terrifying reality of human existence. That all his money, all his power, and all his influence were entirely useless. He was completely at the mercy of the woman he had tried to destroy. "Dr. Carter," Richard gasped, taking a step toward her, his hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Please." Josie stopped at the surgical line. She looked at him, her expression a mask of pure clinical professionalism. She didn't smile, and she didn't scowl. She simply looked at him and delivered the absolute truth. "I am going to go into that room, Mr. Pendleton," Josie said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet hallway. "And I am going to do everything in my power to save your granddaughter's life. Not for you, but for her." She turned around, pushed through the swinging doors into the scrub room, and let them close firmly behind her, leaving the billionaire alone in the waiting room to reckon with the ghosts of his own arrogance. The scrub room at Wellington Hospital was a sanctuary of stark, white light and the sharp, chemical scent of chlorhexidine. For Dr. Josephine Carter, This was holy ground. As she worked the heavy bristle brush over her hands and forearms, the residual fatigue from her transatlantic flight and the ugly confrontation in the first-class cabin washed down the stainless steel drain. Through the glass partition, she could see Theatre 4. It was a hive of controlled chaos. 8-year-old Lily Pendleton lay in the center of the room, her small head secured in a rigid Mayfield clamp, a halo of steel pins keeping her skull perfectly motionless. The anesthesiologist, Dr. R.S. Kensington, was intensely monitoring a bank of screens that displayed a terrifying narrative. Lily's intracranial pressure was spiking dangerously high. Her brain was running out of room. Josie backed through the swinging doors, her dripping hands held out in front of her. A scrub nurse immediately stepped forward, enveloping her in a sterile blue gown and snapping a pair of size 6.5 latex gloves over her cuffs. "All right, everyone," Josie said. Her voice, amplified slightly by her surgical mask, was low, steady, and stripped of any emotion. It was the voice of a commander on a battlefield. "Let's bring the room temperature down to 62 degrees. I need absolute silence, unless it pertains to the patient's vitals. Dr. Hayes, you will assist. Dr. Kensington, keep her systolic pressure exactly where it is until I access the dura." "Yes, Dr. Carter," Hayes replied, his deference absolute. Josie stepped up to the operating table. She looked down at the small, fragile expanse of skull that had already been exposed by the British team. She adjusted the high-powered surgical loops on her glasses, bringing the microscopic battlefield into sharp, magnified focus. The traumatic brain injury had caused a massive subarachnoid hemorrhage, but the real monster hiding in the dark was the arteriovenous malformation, a tangled, knotted web of abnormal blood vessels that had ruptured upon impact. It was pulsing angrily, a literal ticking time bomb situated perilously close to the motor cortex. One wrong millimeter with the scalpel, one slight tremor of the hand, and Lily would be paralyzed for the rest of her life, if she survived the bleeding. "Scalpel," Josie demanded. The instrument slapped into her palm. For the next 7 hours, Theatre 4 existed in a state of suspended animation. The only sounds were the rhythmic, synthetic breathing of the ventilator, the steady beep of the heart monitor, and the sharp, clipped commands from Josie. She worked with a terrifying, beautiful precision. She used a high-speed drill to widen the craniotomy window, then delicately cut through the dura mater, the tough, leathery membrane protecting the brain. As the flap was pulled back, the catastrophic reality of the injury was exposed. Dark, clotted blood obscured the fragile tissue. "Suction. Bipolar electrocautery," Josie ordered. She began the agonizingly slow process of clearing the hemorrhage, millimeters at a time, navigating the microscopic valleys of the brain. She was operating on a razor's edge of exhaustion, her muscles screaming in protest. But her mind was a steel trap. She was no longer a weary traveler. She was an extension of the instruments in her hands. Suddenly, the high-pitched alarm of the vital monitor sliced through the silence. "Pressure is dropping. We have an active bleeder in the deep parietal field," Dr. Kensington warned, his voice tight with panic. Blood instantly flooded the surgical site, turning the magnified view into a sea of opaque red. The ruptured AVM had blown a secondary vessel. "Suction on maximum," Dr. Hayes yelled, leaning in, his hands shaking slightly. "Dr. Carter, we're losing visualization." "Do not panic in my OR, Harrison," Josie snapped, her voice like cracking ice. "Maintain suction. Give me a 7mm titanium clip, now!" She didn't wait for the bleeding to stop. She couldn't. Relying entirely on her encyclopedic knowledge of neurovascular anatomy and the 3D mental map she had memorized from the scans, Josie plunged her instruments blindly into the pool of blood. She felt for the exact microscopic pulse of the feeding artery. There. With a microscopic squeeze of her forceps, she deployed the titanium clip. The terrifying rush of blood instantly ceased. The suction cleared the field, revealing the metallic clip perfectly sealed across the base of the ruptured vessel, mere fractions of a millimeter away from the healthy motor cortex tissue. A collective shuddering exhale echoed through the operating room. Dr. Hayes stared at the microscopic monitor in absolute disbelief. Brilliant. Bloody brilliant. "We aren't done," Josie said, not breaking her focus for a microsecond. "Let's isolate the rest of this malformation and get it out." While Josie performed miracles under the surgical lights, a very different kind of reckoning was unfolding in the private waiting room 3 floors below. Richard Pendleton paced the length of the plush, carpeted room like a caged animal. He had shed his bespoke suit jacket and torn off his tie. He looked 10 years older than he had on the aircraft. Every time the heavy wooden door clicked, he flinched, terrified it would be a nurse coming to deliver the news that his bloodline had ended. His son, William, sat heavily on a leather sofa, staring blankly at a muted television screen. The silence between them was suffocating. Richard couldn't hold it in anymore. The guilt was acid in his stomach. He stopped pacing and looked at his son. "William, I need to tell you something. About Dr. Carter. About the flight." William didn't look up. "Dad, please, not now. I can't handle your complaints about commercial airlines right now. My daughter is having her skull opened." "No, you don't understand," Richard choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I didn't know who she was. She was wearing sweatpants. She was in my row. I told her she belonged in economy. I told her she was a diversity hire. I threatened to have her arrested, William. I threatened to destroy her career." William slowly turned his head. The blank shock in his eyes morphed into a cold, terrifying comprehension. "You did what?" "I was stressed." "Sir," Richard pleaded, stepping forward, his hands trembling. "I was terrified for Lily. I lashed out. I didn't know she was the surgeon. I didn't know she was the only one who could save her." William stood up. He was a few inches shorter than his father, but in that moment he towered over him. "You humiliated the woman who is currently holding my daughter's brain in her hands because she was a black woman in sweatpants sitting near you? I made a mistake." "You didn't make a mistake, Dad," William said, his voice dropping to a harsh, disgusted whisper. "You showed exactly who you are. You have always been like this. Arrogant, cruel, believing the world is your personal country club, and now the universe has put my daughter's life in the hands of a woman you treated like garbage." Before Richard could formulate a defense, William's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out. It wasn't an update from the surgical team. It was a text from the Chief Communications Officer of Pendleton Global Logistics, accompanied by a link. William tapped the link. The screen buffered for a second before a video began playing. It was shaky footage from the first-class cabin of Flight 114, filmed from across the aisle by the young tech entrepreneur, Arthur. The audio was crystal clear. And then Josie's calm, devastating response. "Your family paid $20,000 for me to sit in this seat, because my hands are the only thing standing between your granddaughter and the grave." The video had been uploaded to X 2 hours ago. It already had 4 million views. The hashtag #PendletonGlobalCEO was trending at #1 worldwide. William stared at the phone, then slowly looked up at his father. "What is it?" Richard asked, his voice trembling as he saw the pure revulsion on his son's face. "Karma," William whispered. He turned the phone around so Richard could see his own red, furious face on the screen. "Your board of directors is calling me. The company's stock has dropped 8% in the last hour. The internet is calling for a global boycott of your shipping lines." Richard staggered backward, collapsing into a chair. The blood rushed from his head. He was watching his empire burn to the ground, ignited by a match he had struck purely out of vanity and prejudice. "William, fix this," Richard begged, reverting to the only tactic he knew. "Call PR, issue an apology, offer her money, a lot of money." "I am not fixing anything for you ever again," William said, his voice dead of all affection. "If Lily survives this, you are not coming near her. You are done, Dad. With the company. With me. With this family." 12 hours and 40 minutes after she made the first incision, Dr. Josephine Carter stepped back from the operating table. Her shoulders ached with a deep, burning fire. Her eyes were bloodshot behind her protective lenses, and her hands, which had been as steady as bedrock for half a day, finally developed a slight, exhausted tremor. "Skin closed, sterile dressings applied," Dr. Hayes announced, stepping back as well. He looked at Josie with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. "Her intracranial pressure is completely normalized. The AVM is entirely resected without a single microbleed in the surrounding tissue. Dr. Carter, I have never seen anything like that in my entire career. It was an honor." Josie pulled her mask down, taking her first deep, unfiltered breath in half a day. She offered a tired, genuine smile. "Thank you, Harrison. Let's get her to the pediatric intensive care unit. She's going to need aggressive monitoring for the next 48 hours, but she is out of the woods. The brain is remarkably resilient in children." Josie stripped off her blood-spattered gown and gloves, washing her hands one final time. She changed back into a faded Yale hoodie and sweat pants. She didn't care that they were rumpled. She felt like she was wearing the armor of a conqueror. She walked down the sterile corridor towards the private waiting room. Her footsteps felt heavy, but her spirit was incredibly light. She had done it. Against all odds, the fatigue and the hostile environment, she had saved the girl. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the waiting room, William Pendleton practically leapt from his seat. Richard remained frozen in his chair in the corner, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. "Dr. Carter?" William asked, his voice cracking, terrified of the answer. Josie didn't make him wait. She offered a soft, warm smile. "She's going to be fine, William. The surgery was a complete success. We removed the malformation and stopped the bleeding. She is resting in the PICU. Assuming there are no secondary infections, she should wake up in a few hours, and I expect a full neurological recovery." William collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands as he openly, loudly sobbed. It was the sound of a father whose universe had just been handed back to him. He grabbed Josie's hand, pressing it to his forehead. "Thank you, thank you. I owe you my life. I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything," Josie said gently, pulling him up to his feet. "Go wash your face. The nurses will come get you when you can go in and sit with her." William nodded frantically, wiping his eyes, and practically sprinted out of the room towards the restrooms. Josie was left alone in the room with Richard Pendleton. The billionaire slowly stood up. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked entirely broken. His phone, resting on the coffee table, was vibrating relentlessly, flashing with frantic messages from board members, PR fixers, and furious investors. His career was in free fall. His son had disowned him. His legacy was permanently stained by a viral video showcasing his cruelty. He looked at Josie, his eyes completely bloodshot. "Dr. Carter," Richard whispered. His voice was completely devoid of its former arrogance. It was the voice of a defeated man. "Thank you for saving my granddaughter. I don't know how to apologize to you for what I said, for how I treated you." Josie looked at him. She felt no anger toward him anymore. He wasn't worth the energy. She only felt a profound, clinical pity. "I meant what I said on the plane, Mr. Pendleton," Josie said quietly. "I didn't do this for you. I did it for Lily. She has a long life ahead of her. I hope she grows up to be nothing like you." Richard flinched, the words striking him harder than any physical blow could have. He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling, and pulled out a leather checkbook. "Please, let me compensate you for your trouble, for the disrespect. Name your price. 2 million, 5 million. I will write it right now." Josie looked at the checkbook, then up at his desperate face. He was still trying to buy absolution. He still didn't understand. "Keep your money, Richard," Josie said, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "You're going to need it to buy a new reputation. And unfortunately for you, there isn't a surgeon on earth who can operate on a diseased conscience. She turned her back on him and walked out of the waiting room, leaving him standing alone in the deafening silence of his own making. Josie walked down the hospital corridor, the morning sun streaming through the large glass windows of the London hospital, warming her face. She pulled her phone out and sent a quick text to the chief of surgery back at Hopkins. Surgery successful, patient stable, headed to the hotel to sleep for a week. She slid the phone into the pocket of her faded sweatpants, adjusting her messy bun. She was exhausted, her bones ached, and she was thousands of miles from home. But as she walked out into the cool English morning to find a taxi, Dr. Josephine Carter had never felt more powerful. The story of Flight 114 became a modern parable, a viral testament to the brutal, unyielding efficiency of karma. Richard Pendleton was forced to resign as CEO of Pendleton Global Logistics just 3 days later, his reputation decimated by the irrefutable evidence of his own prejudice. He spent his remaining years isolated, alienated by his son, and haunted by the knowledge that his wealth could not shield him from the consequences of his arrogance. Meanwhile, Dr. Josephine Carter returned to Baltimore, continuing her life-saving work, entirely unbothered by the media frenzy. The incident serves as a stark, timeless reminder. True power does not reside in a bespoke suit or a first-class ticket, but in the quiet, undeniable gravity of human competence and dignity. Respect is not a currency to be hoarded. It is a debt we owe to everyone we meet, because we never know whose hands might one day hold our salvation.